The superintendent said to me, "I only keep you out of regard for your worthy father, but for that you would have been sent flying long ago." I replied to him, "You flatter me too much, Your Excellency, in assuming that I am capable of flying." And then I heard him say, "Take that gentleman away, he gets upon my nerves." 2 days later I was dismissed. And in this way I have, during the years I have been regarded as grown up, lost 9 situations, to the great mortification of my father, the architect of our town. I have served in various departments, but all these 9 jobs have been as alike as one drop of water is to another. I had to sit, write, listen to rude or stupid observations, and go on doing so till I was dismissed. When I came in to my father, he was sitting buried in a low armchair with his eyes closed. His dry, emaciated face, with a shade of dark blue where it was shaved, he looked like an old Catholic organist, expressed meekness and resignation. Without responding to my greeting or opening his eyes, he said, "If my dear wife and your mother were living, your life would have been a source of continual distress to her. I see the divine providence in her premature death. I beg you, unhappy boy," he continued, opening his eyes, "tell me, what am I to do with you? In the past, when I was younger, my friends and relations had known what to do with me. Some of them used to advise me to volunteer for the army, others to get a job in a pharmacy, and others in the telegraph department. Now that I am over 25, that gray hairs are beginning to show on my temples, and that I have been already in the army, and in a pharmacy, and in the telegraph department, it would seem that all earthly possibilities have been exhausted, and people have given up advising me, and merely sigh or shake their heads. What do you think about yourself?" my father went on. "By the time they are your age, young men have a secure social position, while look at you, you are a proletarian, a beggar, a burden on your father." And as usual, he proceeded to declare that the young people of today were on the road to perdition through infidelity, materialism, and self-conceit, and that amateur theatricals ought to be prohibited because they seduced young people from religion and their duties. "Tomorrow we shall go together, and you shall apologize to the superintendent and promise him to work conscientiously," he said in conclusion. "You ought not to remain one single day with no regular position in society." "I beg you to listen to me," I said sullenly, expecting nothing good from this conversation. "What you call a position in society is the privilege of capital and education. Those who have neither wealth nor education earn their daily bread by manual labor, and I see no grounds for my being an exception. When you begin talking about manual labor, it is always stupid and vulgar," said my father with irritation. "Understand, you dense fellow, understand, you addle-pate, that besides coarse physical strength you have the divine spirit, a spark of the holy fire, which distinguishes you in the most striking way from the ass or the reptile, and brings you nearer to the deity. This fire is the fruit of the efforts of the best of mankind during thousands of years. Your great-grandfather Poloznev, the general, fought at Borodino. Your grandfather was a poet, an orator, and a marshal of nobility. Your uncle is a schoolmaster, and lastly, I, your father, am an architect. All the Poloznevs have guarded the sacred fire for you to put it out. One must be just, I said. Millions of people put up with manual labor, and let them put up with it. They don't know how to do anything else. Anybody, even the most abject fool or criminal, is capable of manual labor. Such labor is the distinguishing mark of the slave and the barbarian, while the holy fire is vouchsafed only to a few. To continue this conversation was unprofitable. My father worshipped himself, and nothing was convincing to him but what he said himself. Besides, I knew perfectly well that the disdain with which he talked of physical toil was founded not so much on reverence for the sacred fire as on a secret dread that I should become a workman and should set the whole town talking about me. What was worse, all my contemporaries had long ago taken their degrees and were getting on well, and the son of the manager of the state bank was already a collegiate assessor, while I, his only son, was nothing. To continue the conversation was unprofitable and unpleasant, but I still sat on and feebly retorted, hoping that I might at last be understood. The whole question, of course, was clear and simple, and only concerned with the means of my earning my living, but the simplicity of it was not seen, and I was talked to in mawkishly rounded phrases of Borodino, of the sacred fire, of my uncle, a forgotten poet, who had once written poor and artificial verses. I was rudely called an addlepate and a dense fellow. And how I longed to be understood. In spite of everything, I loved my father and my sister, and it had been my habit from childhood to consult them, a habit so deeply rooted that I doubt whether I could ever have got rid of it, whether I were in the right or the wrong. I was in constant dread of wounding them, constantly afraid that my father's thin neck would turn crimson and that he would have a stroke. To sit in a stuffy room, I began, to copy, to compete with a typewriter, is shameful and humiliating for a man of my age. What can the sacred fire have to do with it? It's intellectual work. Anyway, said my father. But that's enough. Let us cut short this conversation, and in any case I warn you if you don't go back to your work again. But follow your contemptible propensities, then my daughter and I will banish you from our hearts. I shall strike you out of my will, I swear by the living God. With perfect sincerity, to prove the purity of the motives by which I wanted to be guided in all my doings, I said. The question of inheritance does not seem very important to me. I shall renounce it all beforehand. For some reason or other, quite to my surprise, these words were deeply resented by my father. He turned crimson. Don't dare to talk to me like that. Stupid, he shouted in a thin, shrill voice, wastrel, and with a rapid, skillful, and habitual movement he slapped me twice in the face. "You are forgetting yourself." When my father beat me as a child, I had to stand up straight, with my hands held stiffly to my trouser seams, and look him straight in the face. And now, when he hit me, I was utterly overwhelmed, and as though I were still a child, drew myself up and tried to look him in the face. My father was old and very thin, but his delicate muscles must have been as strong as leather, for his blows hurt a good deal. I staggered back into the passage, and there he snatched up his umbrella, and with it hit me several times on the head and shoulders. At that moment, my sister opened the drawing-room door to find out what the noise was, but at once turned away with a look of horror and pity without uttering a word in my defense. My determination not to return to the government office, but to begin a new life of toil, was not to be shaken. All that was left for me to do was to fix upon the special employment, and there was no particular difficulty about that, as it seemed to me that I was very strong and fitted for the very heaviest labor. I was faced with a monotonous life of toil in the midst of hunger, coarseness, and stench, continually preoccupied with earning my daily bread. And who knows, as I returned from my work along Great Dvoriansky Street, I might very likely envy Dolzhikov, the engineer, who lived by intellectual work, but at the moment, thinking over all my future hardships made me light-hearted. At times I had dreamed of spiritual activity, imagining myself a teacher, a doctor, or a writer, but these dreams remain dreams. The taste for intellectual pleasures, for the theater, for instance, and for reading was a passion with me, but whether I had any ability for intellectual work, I don't know. At school I had had an unconquerable aversion for Greek, so that I was only in the 4th class when they had to take me from school. For a long while I had coaches preparing me for the 5th class. Then I served in various government offices, spending the greater part of the day in complete idleness, and I was told that was intellectual work. My activity in the scholastic and official sphere had required neither mental application nor talent, nor special qualifications, nor creative impulse. It was mechanical. Such intellectual work I put on a lower level than physical toil. I despise it, and I don't think that for one moment it could serve as a justification for an idle, careless life, as it is indeed nothing but a sham, one of the forms of that same idleness. Real intellectual work I have in all probability never known. Evening came on. We lived in Great Dvoriansky Street. It was the principal street in the town, and in the absence of decent public gardens, our beau monde used to use it as a promenade in the evenings. This charming street did, to some extent, take the place of a public garden, as on each side of it there was a row of poplars which smelt sweet, particularly after rain, and acacias, tall bushes of lilac, wild cherries, and apple trees hung over the fences and palings. The May twilight, the tender young greenery with its shifting shades, the scent of the lilac, the buzzing of the insects, the stillness, the warmth, how fresh and marvelous it all is, though spring is repeated every year. I stood at the garden gate and watched the passers-by. With most of them I had grown up, and at one time played pranks. Now they might have been disconcerted by my being near them, for I was poorly and unfashionably dressed. And they used to say of my very narrow trousers and huge, clumsy boots that they were like sticks of macaroni stuck in boats. Besides, I had a bad reputation in the town because I had no decent social position and used often to play billiards in cheap taverns, and also, perhaps, because I had on 2 occasions been hauled up before an officer of the police, though I had done nothing whatever to account for this. In the big house opposite, someone was playing the piano at Dolzhikov's. It was beginning to get dark, and stars were twinkling in the sky. Here my father, in an old top hat with wide upturned brim, walked slowly by with my sister on his arm, bowing in response to greetings. "Look up," he said to my sister, pointing to the sky with the same umbrella with which he had beaten me that afternoon. "Look up at the sky. Even the tiniest stars are all worlds. How insignificant is man in comparison with the universe." And he said this in a tone that suggested that it was particularly agreeable and flattering to him that he was so insignificant. How absolutely devoid of talent and imagination he was. Sad to say, he was the only architect in the town, and in the 15 to 20 years that I could remember, not one single decent house had been built in it. When anyone asked him to plan a house, he usually drew first the reception hall and drawing room, just as in old days the boarding school misses always started from the stove when they danced. So his artistic ideas could only begin and develop from the hall and drawing room. To them he tacked on a dining room, a nursery, a study, linking the rooms together with doors, and so they all inevitably turned into passages, and every one of them had 2 or even 3 unnecessary doors. His imagination must have been lacking in clearness, extremely muddled, curtailed. As though feeling that something was lacking, he invariably had recourse to all sorts of outbuildings, planting one beside another, and I can see now the narrow entries, the poky little passages, the crooked staircases leading to half landings where one could not stand upright, and where, instead of a floor, there were 3 huge steps like the shelves of a bathhouse, and the kitchen was invariably in the basement with a brick floor and vaulted ceilings. The front of the house had a harsh, stubborn expression. The lines of it were stiff and timid. The roof was low-pitched and, as it were, squashed down, and the fat, well-fed-looking chimneys were invariably crowned by wire caps with squeaking black cowls. And for some reason all these houses, built by my father exactly like one another, vaguely reminded me of his top hat and the back of his head, stiff and stubborn-looking. In the course of years they have grown used in the town to the poverty of my father's imagination. It has taken root and become our local style. This same style my father had brought into my sister's life also, beginning with christening her Cleopatra, just as he had named me Miss Ale. When she was a little girl, he scared her by references to the stars, to the sages of ancient times, to our ancestors, and discoursed at length on the nature of life and duty. And now, when she was 26, he kept up the same habits, allowing her to walk arm in arm with no one but himself, and imagining for some reason that sooner or later a suitable young man would be sure to appear, and to desire to enter into matrimony with her from respect for his personal qualities. She adored my father, feared him, and believed in his exceptional intelligence. It was quite dark, and gradually the street grew empty. The music had ceased and the house opposite the gate was thrown wide open, and a team with 3 horses trotted frolicking along our street with a soft tinkle of little bells. That was the engineer going for a drive with his daughter. It was bedtime. I had my own room in the house, but I lived in a shed in the yard, under the same roof as a brick barn which had been built some time or other. Probably to keep harness and great hooks were driven into the wall. Now it was not wanted, and for the last 30 years my father had stowed away in it his newspapers, which for some reason he had bound in half-yearly volumes and allowed nobody to touch. Living here, I was less liable to be seen by my father and his visitors, and I fancied that if I did not live in a real room, and did not go into the house every day to dinner, my father's words that I was a burden upon him did not sound so offensive. My sister was waiting for me. Unseen by my father, she had brought me some supper, not a very large slice of cold veal and a piece of bread. In our house such sayings as a penny saved is a penny gained, and take care of the pence, and the pounds will take care of themselves, and so on, were frequently repeated. And my sister, weighed down by these vulgar maxims, did her utmost to cut down the expenses, and so we fared badly. Putting the plate on the table, she sat down on my bed and began to cry. "Miss Ale," she said, "what a way to treat us." She did not cover her face, her tears dropped on her bosom and hands, and there was a look of distress on her face. She fell back on the pillow and abandoned herself to her tears, sobbing and quivering all over. "You have left the service again," she articulated. "Oh, how awful it is! But do understand, sister, do understand," I said, and I was overcome with despair because she was crying. As ill luck would have it, the kerosene in my little lamp was exhausted. It began to smoke and was on the point of going out, and the old hooks on the walls looked down sullenly, and their shadows flickered. "Have mercy on us," said my sister, sitting up. "Father is in terrible distress, and I am ill. I shall go out of my mind." "What will become of you?" she said, sobbing and stretching out her arms to me. "I beg you, I implore you, for our dear mother's sake, I beg you to go back to the office." "I can't, Cleopatra," I said, feeling that a little more and I should give way. "I cannot." "Why not?" my sister went on. "Why not?" "Well, if you can't get on with the head, look out for another post. Why shouldn't you get a situation on the railway, for instance? I have just been talking to Anyuta Blagovo. She declares they would take you on the railway line, and even promised to try and get a post for you. For God's sake, Miss Ale, think a little. Think a little, I implore you." We talked a little longer and I gave way. I said that the thought of a job on the railway that was being constructed had never occurred to me, and that if she liked, I was ready to try it. She smiled joyfully through her tears and squeezed my hand, and then went on crying because she could not stop, while I went to the kitchen for some kerosene. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Among the devoted supporters of amateur theatricals, concerts and tableaux vivants for charitable objects, the Azhogins, who lived in their own house in Great Dvoryansky Street, took a foremost place. They always provided the room, and took upon themselves all the troublesome arrangements and the expenses. They were a family of wealthy landowners who had an estate of some 9,000 acres in the district and a capital house, but they did not care for the country and lived winter and summer alike in the town. The family consisted of the mother, a tall, spare, refined lady with short hair, a short jacket, and a flat-looking skirt in the English fashion, and 3 daughters who, when they were spoken of, were called not by their names but simply the eldest, the middle, and the youngest. They all had ugly sharp chins, and were short-sighted and round-shouldered. They were dressed like their mother, they lisped disagreeably, and yet, in spite of that, infallibly took part in every performance, and were continually doing something with a charitable object, acting, reciting, singing. They were very serious and never smiled, and even in a musical comedy they played without the faintest trace of gaiety, with a businesslike air, as though they were engaged in bookkeeping. I loved our theatricals, especially the numerous, noisy, and rather incoherent rehearsals, after which they always gave a supper. In the choice of the plays and the distribution of the parts I had no hand at all. The post assigned to me lay behind the scenes. I painted the scenes, copied out the parts, prompted, made up the actors' faces, and I was entrusted, too, with various stage effects such as thunder, the singing of nightingales, and so on. Since I had no proper social position and no decent clothes, at the rehearsals I held aloof from the rest in the shadows of the wings and maintained a shy silence. I painted the scenes at the Azhogins, either in the barn or in the yard. I was assisted by Andrei Ivanov, a house painter, or, as he called himself, a contractor for all kinds of house decorations, a tall, very thin, pale man of 50, with a hollow chest, with sunken temples, with blue rings round his eyes, rather terrible to look at in fact. He was afflicted with some internal malady, and every autumn and spring people said that he wouldn't recover, but after being laid up for a while he would get up and say afterwards with surprise, "I have escaped dying again." In the town he was called Radish, and they declared that this was his real name. He was as fond of the theater as I was, and as soon as rumors reached him that a performance was being got up, he threw aside all his work and went to the Ajogans to paint scenes. The day after my talk with my sister, I was working at the Ajogans from morning till night. The rehearsal was fixed for 7 o'clock in the evening, and an hour before it began all the amateurs were gathered together in the hall, and the eldest, the middle, and the youngest Ajogans were pacing about the stage, reading from manuscript books. Radish, in a long rusty red overcoat and a scarf muffled round his neck, already stood leaning with his head against the wall, gazing with a devout expression at the stage. Madame Ajogin went up first to one and then to another guest, saying something agreeable to each. She had a way of gazing into one's face and speaking softly as though telling a secret. "It must be difficult to paint scenery," she said softly, coming up to me. "I was just talking to Madame Mufke about superstitions when I saw you come in. My goodness, my whole life I have been waging war against superstitions, to convince the servants what nonsense all their terrors are. I always light 3 candles and begin all my important undertakings on the 13th of the month." Dolzhikov's daughter came in, a plump, fair beauty, dressed, as people said, in everything from Paris. She did not act, but a chair was set for her on the stage at the rehearsals, and the performances never began till she had appeared in the front row, dazzling and astounding everyone with her fine clothes. As a product of the capital, she was allowed to make remarks during the rehearsals, and she did so with a sweet, indulgent smile, and one could see that she looked upon our performance as a childish amusement. It was said she had studied singing at the Petersburg Conservatoire, and even sang for a whole winter in a private opera. I thought her very charming, and I usually watched her through the rehearsals and performances without taking my eyes off her. I had just picked up the manuscript book to begin prompting when my sister suddenly made her appearance. Without taking off her cloak or hat, she came up to me and said, "Come along, I beg you." I went with her. Anyuta Blagovo, also in her hat and wearing a dark veil, was standing behind the scenes at the door. She was the daughter of the assistant president of the court, who had held that office in our town almost ever since the establishment of the circuit court. Since she was tall and had a good figure, her assistance was considered indispensable for tableaux vivants, and when she represented a fairy or something like Glory, her face burned with shame. But she took no part in dramatic performances, and came to the rehearsals only for a moment on some special errand, and did not go into the hall. Now, too, it was evident that she had only looked in for a minute. My father was speaking about you, she said dryly, blushing and not looking at me. Dolzhikov has promised you a post on the railway line. Apply to him tomorrow, he will be at home. I bowed and thanked her for the trouble she had taken. And you can give up this, she said, indicating the exercise book. My sister, and she went up to Madame Ozhogin, and for 2 minutes they were whispering with her, looking towards me. They were consulting about something. Yes, indeed, said Madame Ozhogin, softly coming up to me and looking intently into my face. Yes, indeed, if this distracts you from serious pursuits. She took the manuscript book from my hands. You can hand it over to someone else. Don't distress yourself, my friend. Go home, and good luck to you. I said goodbye to her and went away overcome with confusion. As I went down the stairs, I saw my sister and Inyuta Blagovo going away. They were hastening along, talking eagerly about something, probably about my going into the railway service. My sister had never been at a rehearsal before, and now she was most likely conscience-stricken and afraid her father might find out that, without his permission, she had been to the Ozhogins. I went to Dolzhikov's next day between 12 and 1. The footman conducted me into a very beautiful room, which was the engineer's drawing room, and, at the same time, his working study. Everything here was soft and elegant, and for a man so unaccustomed to luxury as I was, it seemed strange. There were costly rugs, huge armchairs, bronzes, pictures, gold and plush frames. Among the photographs scattered about the walls there were very beautiful women, clever, lovely faces, easy attitudes. From the drawing room there was a door leading straight into the garden onto a veranda. One could see lilac trees, one could see a table laid for lunch, a number of bottles, a bouquet of roses. There was a fragrance of spring and expensive cigars, a fragrance of happiness, and everything seemed as though it would say, "Here is a man who has lived and labored, and has attained at last the happiness possible on earth." The engineer's daughter was sitting at the writing table, reading a newspaper. "You have come to see my father?" she asked. "He is having a shower bath. He will be here directly. Please sit down and wait." I sat down. "I believe you live opposite?" she questioned me. After a brief silence, "Yes." "I am so bored that I watch you every day out of the window. You must excuse me," she went on, looking at the newspaper, "and I often see your sister. She always has such a look of kindness and concentration." Dolzhikov came in. He was rubbing his neck with a towel. "Papa," Monsieur Poloznev said, his daughter. "Yes, yes," Blagovo was telling me. He turned briskly to me without giving me his hand. "But listen, what can I give you? What sort of posts have I got? You are a queer set of people," he went on aloud in a tone as though he were giving me a lecture. A score of you keep coming to me every day. You imagine I am the head of a department. I am constructing a railway line, my friends. I have employment for heavy labor. I need mechanics, smiths, navvies, carpenters, well sinkers, and none of you can do anything but sit and write. You are all clerks. And he seemed to me to have the same air of happiness as his rugs and easy chairs. He was stout and healthy, ruddy-cheeked and broad-chested, in a print cotton shirt and full trousers like a toy china sledge driver. He had a curly, round beard and not a single gray hair, a hooked nose, and clear, dark, guileless eyes. "What can you do?" he went on. "There is nothing you can do. I am an engineer. I am a man of an assured position, but before they gave me a railway line, I was for years in harness. I have been a practical mechanic. For 2 years I worked in Belgium as an oiler. You can judge for yourself, my dear fellow. What kind of work can I offer you?" "Of course, that is so," I muttered in extreme confusion, unable to face his clear, guileless eyes. "Can you work the telegraph?" "Anyway?" he asked. After a moment's thought, "Yes, I have been a telegraph clerk." "HM. Well, we will see then. Meanwhile, go to Dubechnia. I have got a fellow there, but he is a wretched creature." "And what will my duties consist of?" I asked. "We shall see. Go there. Meanwhile, I will make arrangements. Only please don't get drunk, and don't worry me with requests of any sort, or I shall send you packing." He turned away from me without even a nod. I bowed to him and his daughter, who was reading a newspaper, and went away. My heart felt so heavy that when my sister began asking me how the engineer had received me, I could not utter a single word. I got up early in the morning, at sunrise, to go to Dubechnia. There was not a soul in our great Dvoriensky Street. Everyone was asleep, and my footsteps rang out with a solitary, hollow sound. The poplars, covered with dew, filled the air with soft fragrance. I was sad and did not want to go away from the town. I was fond of my native town. It seemed to be so beautiful and so snug. I loved the fresh greenery, the still, sunny morning, the chiming of our bells, but the people with whom I lived in this town were boring, alien to me, sometimes even repulsive. I did not like them, nor understand them. I did not understand what these 65,000 people lived for and by. I knew that Kimry lived by boots, that Tula made samovars and guns, that Odessa was a seaport, but what our town was, and what it did, I did not know. Great Dvoriensky Street and the 2 other smartest streets lived on the interest of capital, or on salaries received by officials from the public treasury, but what the other 8 streets, which ran parallel for over 2 miles and vanished beyond the hills, lived upon, was always an insoluble riddle to me. and the way those people lived one is a shame to describe. No garden, no theater, no decent band. The public library and the club library were only visited by Jewish youths, so that the magazines and new books lay for months uncut. Rich and well-educated people slept in close, stuffy bedrooms, on wooden bedsteads infested with bugs. Their children were kept in revoltingly dirty rooms called nurseries, and the servants, even the old and respected ones, slept on the floor in the kitchen, covered with rags. On ordinary days the houses smelt of beetroot soup, and on fast days of sturgeon cooked in sunflower oil. The food was not good, and the drinking water was unwholesome. In the town council, at the governors, at the head priests, on all sides in private houses, people had been saying for years and years that our town had not a good and cheap water supply, and that it was necessary to obtain a loan of 200,000 from the treasury for laying on water very rich people, of whom 3 dozen could have been counted up in our town, and who at times lost whole estates at cards, drank the polluted water, too, and talked all their lives with great excitement of a loan for the water supply, and I did not understand that. It seemed to me it would have been simpler to take the 200,000 out of their own pockets and lay it out on that object. I did not know one honest man in the town. My father took bribes and imagined that they were given him out of respect for his moral qualities at the high school, in order to be moved up rapidly from class to class. The boys went to board with their teachers, who charged them exorbitant sums. The wife of the military commander took bribes from the recruits when they were called up before the board, and even deigned to accept refreshments from them, and on one occasion could not get up from her knees in church, because she was drunk. The doctors took bribes too. When the recruits came up for examination, and the town doctor and the veterinary surgeon levied a regular tax on the butcher's shops and the restaurants at the district school, they did a trade in certificates, qualifying for partial exemption from military service. The higher clergy took bribes from the humbler priests and from the church elders. At the municipal, the artisans, and all the other boards, every petitioner was pursued by a shout, "Don't forget your thanks," and the petitioner would turn back to give 6 pence or a shilling. And those who did not take bribes, such as the higher officials of the Department of Justice, were haughty, offered 2 fingers instead of shaking hands, were distinguished by the frigidity and narrowness of their judgments, spent a great deal of time over cards, drank to excess, married heiresses, and undoubtedly had a pernicious corrupting influence on those around them. It was only the girls who had still the fresh fragrance of moral purity. Most of them had higher impulses, pure and honest hearts, but they had no understanding of life, and believed that bribes were given out of respect for moral qualities, and after they were married grew old quickly, let themselves go completely, and sank hopelessly in the mire of vulgar, petty bourgeois existence. Chapter 3. A railway line was being constructed in our neighborhood. On the eve of feast days, the streets were thronged with ragged fellows whom the townspeople called navvies and of whom they were afraid. And more than once I had seen one of these tatterdemalions with a blood-stained countenance being led to the police station, while a samovar or some linen, wet from the wash, was carried behind by way of material evidence. The navvies usually congregated about the taverns and the marketplace. They drank, ate, and used bad language, and pursued with shrill whistles every woman of light behavior who passed by. To entertain this hungry rabble, our shopkeepers made cats and dogs drunk with vodka, or tied an old kerosene can to a dog's tail. A hue and cry was raised, and the dog dashed along the street, jingling the can, squealing with terror. It fancied some monster was close upon its heels. It would run far out of the town into the open country and there sink exhausted. There were in the town several dogs who went about trembling with their tails between their legs, and people said this diversion had been too much for them and had driven them mad. A station was being built 4 miles from the town. It was said that the engineers asked for a bribe of 50,000 rubles for bringing the line right up to the town, but the town council would only consent to give 40,000. They could not come to an agreement over the difference, and now the townspeople regretted it, as they had to make a road to the station, and that, it was reckoned, would cost more. The sleepers and rails had been laid throughout the whole length of the line, and trains ran up and down it, bringing building materials and laborers, and further progress was only delayed on account of the bridges which Dolzhikov was building, and some of the stations were not yet finished. Dubechnia, as our first station was called, was a little under 12 miles from the town. I walked. The cornfields, bathed in the morning sunshine, were bright green. It was a flat, cheerful country, and in the distance there were the distinct outlines of the station, of ancient barrows and far-away homesteads. How nice it was out there in the open! And how I longed to be filled with the sense of freedom, if only for that one morning, that I might not think of what was being done in the town, not think of my needs, not feel hungry. Nothing has so marred my existence as an acute feeling of hunger, which made images of buckwheat porridge, rissoles, and baked fish mingle strangely with my best thoughts. Here I was standing alone in the open country, gazing upward at a lark which hovered in the air at the same spot, trilling as though in hysterics, and meanwhile I was thinking, how nice it would be to eat a piece of bread and butter. Or I would sit down by the roadside to rest, and shut my eyes to listen to the delicious sounds of May, and what haunted me was the smell of hot potatoes. Though I was tall and strongly built, I had as a rule little to eat, and so the predominant sensation throughout the day was hunger. And perhaps that was why I knew so well how it is that such multitudes of people toil merely for their daily bread, and can talk of nothing but things to eat. At Dubechnia they were plastering the inside of the station, and building a wooden upper story to the pumping shed. It was hot, There was a smell of lime, and the workmen sauntered listlessly between the heaps of shavings and mortar rubble. The pointsman lay asleep near his sentry box, and the sun was blazing full on his face. There was not a single tree. The telegraph wire hummed faintly, and hawks were perching on it here and there. I, wandering too, among the heaps of rubbish, and not knowing what to do, recalled how the engineer, in answer to my question what my duties would consist in, had said, "We shall see when you are there." But what could one see in that wilderness? The plasterer spoke of the foreman and of a certain Fyodot Vasiliev. I did not understand, and gradually I was overcome by depression, the physical depression in which one is conscious of one's arms and legs and huge body and does not know what to do with them or where to put them. After I had been walking about for at least a couple of hours, I noticed that there were telegraph poles running off to the right from the station, and that they ended a mile or a mile and a half away at a white stone wall. The workman told me the office was there, and at last I reflected that that was where I ought to go. It was a very old manor house, deserted long ago. The wall round it, of porous white stone, was moldering and had fallen away in places, and the lodge, the blank wall of which looked out on the open country, had a rusty roof with patches of tin plate gleaming here and there on it. Within the gates could be seen a spacious courtyard overgrown with rough weeds, and an old manor house with sun blinds on the windows, and a high roof red with rust. Two lodges, exactly alike, stood one on each side of the house. To right and to left one had its windows nailed up with boards near the other, of which the windows were open. There was washing on the line, and there were calves moving about. The last of the telegraph poles stood in the courtyard, and the wire from it ran to the window of the lodge, of which the blank wall looked out into the open country. The door stood open. I went in. By the telegraph apparatus a gentleman with a curly dark head, wearing a reefer coat made of sailcloth, was sitting at a table. He glanced at me morosely from under his brows, but immediately smiled and said, "Hullo, better than nothing." It was Ivan Tsheprakov, an old schoolfellow of mine, who had been expelled from the second class for smoking. We used at one time, during autumn, to catch goldfinches, finches, and linnets together, and to sell them in the market early in the morning, while our parents were still in their beds. We watched for flocks of migrating starlings and shot at them with small shot. Then we picked up those that were wounded, and some of them died in our hands in terrible agonies. I remember to this day how they moaned in the cage at night. Those that recovered we sold, and swore with the utmost effrontery that they were all cocks. On one occasion at the market I had only one starling left, which I had offered to purchasers in vain, till at last I sold it for a farthing. "Anyway, it's better than nothing," I said to comfort myself, as I put the farthing in my pocket, and from that day the street urchins and the schoolboys called after me "Better than nothing," and to this day the street boys and the shopkeepers mock at me with the nickname, though no one remembers how it arose. Tsheprikov was not of robust constitution. He was narrow-chested, round-shouldered, and long-legged. He wore a silk cord for a tie, had no trace of a waistcoat, and his boots were worse than mine, with the heels trodden down on one side. He stared, hardly even blinking, with a strained expression, as though he were just going to catch something, and he was always in a fuss. "You wait a minute," he would say fussily. "You listen. Whatever was I talking about?" We got into conversation. I learned that the estate on which I now was had until recently been the property of the Tsheprikovs, and had only the autumn before passed into the possession of Dolzhikov, who considered it more profitable to put his money into land than to keep it in notes, and had already bought up 3 good-sized mortgaged estates in our neighborhood. At the sale, Tsheprikov's mother had reserved for herself the right to live for the next 2 years in one of the lodges at the side, and had obtained a post for her son in the office. "I should think he could buy," Tsheprikov said of the engineer. "See what he fleeces out of the contractors alone. He fleeces everyone." Then he took me to dinner, deciding fussily that I should live with him in the lodge and have my meals from his mother. "She is a bit stingy," he said, "but she won't charge you much." It was very cramped in the little rooms in which his mother lived. They were all, even the passage and the entry, piled up with furniture which had been brought from the big house after the sale, and the furniture was all old-fashioned mahogany. Madame Tsheprikov, a very stout middle-aged lady with slanting Chinese eyes, was sitting in a big armchair by the window, knitting a stocking. She received me ceremoniously. "This is Poloznev," Mama Tsheprikov introduced me. "He is going to serve here." "Are you a nobleman?" she asked in a strange, disagreeable voice. It seemed to me to sound as though fat were bubbling in her throat. "Yes," I answered. "Sit down." K. The dinner was a poor one. Nothing was served but pies filled with bitter curd and milk soup. Elena Nikiforovna, who presided, kept blinking in a queer way, first with one eye and then with the other. She talked, she ate, but yet there was something deathly about her whole figure, and one almost fancied the faint smell of a corpse. There was only a glimmer of life in her, a glimmer of consciousness that she had been a lady who had once had her own serfs, that she was the widow of a general whom the servants had to address as Your Excellency. And when these feeble relics of life flickered up in her for an instant, she would say to her son, "Jean, you are not holding your knife properly." Or she would say to me, drawing a deep breath, with the mincing air of a hostess trying to entertain a visitor, "You know we have sold our estate. Of course, it is a pity. We are used to the place. but Dolzhikov has promised to make Jean station master of Debechnia, so we shall not have to go away. We shall live here at the station, and that is just the same as being on our own property. The engineer is so nice. Don't you think he is very handsome? Until recently, the Tsheprekovs had lived in a wealthy style, but since the death of the general, everything had been changed. Elena Nikiforovna had taken to quarreling with the neighbors, to going to law, and to not paying her bailiffs or her laborers. She was in constant terror of being robbed, and in some 10 years Debechnia had become unrecognizable. Behind the great house was an old garden which had already run wild and was overgrown with rough weeds and bushes. I walked up and down the veranda, which was still solid and beautiful. Through the glass doors one could see a room with parquetted floor. Probably the drawing room, an old-fashioned piano, and pictures in deep mahogany frames. There was nothing else. In the old flower beds all that remained were peonies and poppies, which lifted their white and bright red heads above the grass. Young maples and elms, already nibbled by the cows, grew beside the paths, drawn up and hindering each other's growth. The garden was thickly overgrown and seemed impassable, but this was only near the house, where there stood poplars, fir trees, and old lima trees, all of the same age, relics of the former avenues. Further on, beyond them, the garden had been cleared for the sake of hay, and here it was not moist and stuffy, and there were no spiders' webs in one's mouth and eyes. A light breeze was blowing. The further one went, the more open it was, and here in the open space were cherries, plums, and spreading apple trees, disfigured by props and by canker, and pear trees so tall that one could not believe they were pear trees. This part of the garden was let to some shopkeepers of the town, and it was protected from thieves and starlings by a feeble-minded peasant who lived in a shanty in it. The garden, growing more and more open, till it became definitely a meadow, sloped down to the river, which was overgrown with green weeds and osiers. Near the milldam was the mill pond, deep and full of fish. A little mill with a thatched roof was working away with a wrathful sound, and frogs croaked furiously. Circles passed from time to time over the smooth, mirror-like water, and the water lilies trembled, stirred by the lively fish. On the further side of the river was the little village Debechnia. The still, blue mill pond was alluring with its promise of coolness and peace. And now all this, the mill pond, and the mill and the snug-looking banks, belonged to the engineer. And so my new work began. I received and forwarded telegrams, wrote various reports, and made fair copies of the notes of requirements, the complaints, and the reports sent to the office by the illiterate foremen and workmen. But for the greater part of the day I did nothing but walk about the room waiting for telegrams, or made a boy sit in the lodge while I went for a walk in the garden, until the boy ran to tell me that there was a tapping at the operating machine. I had dinner at Madame Tsheprekov's. Meat we had very rarely. Our dishes were all made of milk, and Wednesdays and Fridays were fast days, and on those days we had pink plates which were called Lenten plates. Madame Tisheprakov was continually blinking. It was her invariable habit, and I always felt ill at ease in her presence. As there was not enough work in the lodge for one, Tisheprakov did nothing, but simply dozed, or went with his gun to shoot ducks on the mill pond. In the evenings he drank too much in the village or the station, and before going to bed stared in the looking glass and said, "Hello, Ivan Tisheprakov." When he was drunk he was very pale and kept rubbing his hands and laughing with a sound like a neigh he. He, by way of bravado, he used to strip and run about the country naked. He used to eat flies and say they were rather sour. Chapter 4. One day, after dinner, he ran breathless into the lodge and said, "Go along. Your sister has come." I went out, and there I found a hired brake from the town standing before the entrance of the great house. My sister had come in it with Anyuta Blagovo and a gentleman in a military tunic. Going up closer, I recognized the latter. It was the brother of Anyuta Blagovo, the army doctor. "We have come to you for a picnic," he said. "Is that all right?" My sister and Anyuta wanted to ask how I was getting on here, but both were silent and simply gazed at me. I was silent too. They saw that I did not like the place, and tears came into my sister's eyes, while Anyuta Blagovo turned crimson. We went into the garden. The doctor walked ahead of us all and said enthusiastically, "What air! Holy Mother, what air!" In appearance he was still a student, and he walked and talked like a student, and the expression of his gray eyes was as keen, honest, and frank as a nice student's. Beside his tall and handsome sister he looked frail and thin, and his beard was thin too, and his voice, too, was a thin but rather agreeable tenor. He was serving in a regiment somewhere, and had come home to his people for a holiday, and said he was going in the autumn to Petersburg for his examination as a doctor of medicine. He was already a family man, with a wife and 3 children. He had married very young, in his 2nd year at the university, and now people in the town said he was unhappy in his family life and was not living with his wife. "What time is it?" my sister asked uneasily. "We must get back in good time. Papa let me come to see my brother on condition I was back at 6. "Oh, bother your papa," sighed the doctor. I set the samovar. We put down a carpet before the veranda of the great house and had our tea there, and the doctor knelt down, drank out of his saucer, and declared that he now knew what bliss was. Then Tisheprakov came with the key and opened the glass door, and we all went into the house. There it was half dark and mysterious, and smelt of mushrooms, and our footsteps had a hollow sound as though there were cellars under the floor. The doctor stopped and touched the keys of the piano, and it responded faintly with a husky, quivering, but melodious chord. He tried his voice and sang a song, frowning and tapping impatiently with his foot when some note was mute. My sister did not talk about going home, but walked about the rooms and kept saying, "How happy I am! How happy I am!" There was a note of astonishment in her voice, as though it seemed to her incredible that she, too, could feel light-hearted. It was the first time in my life I had seen her so happy. She actually looked prettier. In profile, she did not look nice. Her nose and mouth seemed to stick out and had an expression as though she were pouting, but she had beautiful dark eyes, a pale, very delicate complexion, and a touching expression of goodness and melancholy. And when she talked, she seemed charming and even beautiful. We both, she and I, took after our mother, were broad-shouldered, strongly built, and capable of endurance, but her pallor was a sign of ill health. She often had a cough, and I sometimes caught in her face that look one sees in people who are seriously ill, but for some reason conceal the fact. There was something naive and childish in her gaiety now, as though the joy that had been suppressed and smothered in our childhood by harsh education had now suddenly awakened in her soul and found a free outlet. But when evening came on and the horses were brought round, my sister sank into silence and looked thin and shrunken, and she got into the brake as though she were going to the scaffold. When they had all gone, and the sound had died away, I remembered that Anita Blagovo had not said a word to me all day. She is a wonderful girl, I thought. Wonderful girl. St. Peter's fast came, and we had nothing but Lenten dishes every day. I was weighed down by physical depression due to idleness and my unsettled position, and dissatisfied with myself. Listless and hungry, I lounged about the garden and only waited for a suitable mood to go away. Towards evening one day, when Radish was sitting in the lodge, Dolzhikov, very sunburnt and gray with dust, walked in unexpectedly. He had been spending 3 days on his land, and had come now to Debechnia by the steamer and walked to us from the station. While waiting for the carriage, which was to come for him from the town, he walked round the grounds with his bailiff, giving orders in a loud voice, then sat for a whole hour in our lodge, writing letters. While he was there, telegrams came for him, and he himself tapped off the answers. We 3 stood in silence at attention. "What a muddle," he said, glancing contemptuously at a record book. "In a fortnight I am transferring the office to the station, and I don't know what I am to do with you, my friends." "I do my best," Your Honor, said Tisha Prakov. "To be sure, I see how you do your best. The only thing you can do is to take your salary," the engineer went on. "Looking at me, you keep relying on patronage to faire le carrière as quickly and as easily as possible. Well, I don't care for patronage. No one took any trouble on my behalf. Before they gave me a railway contract, I went about as a mechanic and worked in Belgium as an oiler. And you, Panteley, what are you doing here? He asked, turning to Radish. Drinking with them. He, for some reason, always called humble people Panteley, and such as me and Tisha Prokop he despised, and called them drunkards, beasts, and rabble to their faces. Altogether he was cruel to humble subordinates, and used to fine them and turn them off coldly without explanations. At last the horses came for him. As he said goodbye, he promised to turn us all off in a fortnight. He called his bailiff a blockhead and then, lolling at ease in his carriage, drove back to the town. Andrei Ivanitch, I said to Radish, take me on as a workman. Oh, all right. And we set off together in the direction of the town. When the station and the big house with its buildings were left behind, I asked Andrei Ivanitch, why did you come to Debechnia this evening? In the first place, my fellows are working on the line. And in the second place, I came to pay the general's lady my interest. Last year I borrowed 50 rubles from her, and I pay her now a ruble a month interest. The painter stopped and took me by the button. Misail Alexeyitch, our angel, he went on. The way I look at it is that if any man, gentle or simple, takes even the smallest interest, he is doing evil. There cannot be truth and justice in such a man. Radish, lean, pale, dreadful looking, shut his eyes, shook his head, and, in the tone of a philosopher, pronounced, lice consume the grass, rust consumes the iron, and lying the soul. Lord, have mercy upon us sinners. Chapter 5. Radish was not practical and was not at all good at forming an estimate. He took more work than he could get through, and when calculating he was agitated, lost his head, and so was almost always out of pocket over his jobs. He undertook painting, glazing, paper hanging, and even tiling roofs, and I can remember his running about for 3 days to find tilers for the sake of a paltry job. He was a first-rate workman. He sometimes earned as much as 10 rubles a day, and if it had not been for the desire at all costs to be a master and to be called a contractor, he would probably have had plenty of money. He was paid by the job, but he paid me and the other workmen by the day, from 1 and 2pence to 2 shillings a day. When it was fine and dry, we did all kinds of outside work, chiefly painting roofs. When I was new to the work, it made my feet burn as though I were walking on hot bricks, and when I put on felt boots, they were hotter than ever. But this was only at first. Later on, I got used to it, and everything went swimmingly. I was living now among people to whom labor was obligatory, inevitable, and who worked like cart horses, often with no idea of the moral significance of labor, and, indeed, never using the word labor in conversation at all. Beside them I, too, felt like a cart horse, growing more and more imbued with the feeling of the obligatory and inevitable character of what I was doing. And this made my life easier, setting me free from all doubt and uncertainty. At first, everything interested me. Everything was new, as though I had been born again. I could sleep on the ground and go about barefoot, and that was extremely pleasant. I could stand in a crowd of the common people and be no constraint to anyone. And when a cab horse fell down in the street, I ran to help it up without being afraid of soiling my clothes. And the best of it all was, I was living on my own account and no burden to anyone. Painting roofs, especially with our own oil and colors, was regarded as a particularly profitable job, and so this rough, dull work was not disdained, even by such good workmen as Radish. In short breeches and wasted, purple-looking legs, he used to go about the roofs, looking like a stork, and I used to hear him, as he plied his brush, breathing heavily and saying, "Woe, woe to us sinners." He walked about the roofs as freely as though he were upon the ground. In spite of his being ill and pale as a corpse, his agility was extraordinary. He used to paint the domes and cupolas of the churches without scaffolding, like a young man, with only the help of a ladder and a rope, and it was rather horrible when standing on a height far from the earth he would draw himself up erect, and for some unknown reason pronounce, "Lice consume grass, rust consumes iron, and lying the soul," or, thinking about something, would answer his thoughts aloud, "Anything may happen. Anything may happen." When I went home from my work, all the people who were sitting on benches by the gates, all the shopmen and boys and their employers, made sneering and spiteful remarks after me, and this upset me at first and seemed to be simply monstrous. Better than nothing I heard on all sides. House painter, yellow ochre, and none behaved so ungraciously to me as those who had only lately been humble people themselves and had earned their bread by hard manual labor. In the streets full of shops I was once passing an ironmonger's when water was thrown over me as though by accident, and on one occasion someone darted out with a stick at me, while a fishmonger, a gray-headed old man, barred my way and said, looking at me angrily, "I am not sorry for you, you fool. It's your father I am sorry for." And my acquaintances were for some reason overcome with embarrassment when they met me. Some of them looked upon me as a queer fish and a comic fool. Others were sorry for me. Others did not know what attitude to take up to me, and it was difficult to make them out. One day I met Anyuta Blagovo in a side street near Great Dvoryansky Street. I was going to work and was carrying 2 long brushes and a pail of paint. Recognizing me, Anyuta flushed crimson. "Please do not bow to me in the street," she said nervously, harshly, and in a shaking voice, without offering me her hand, and tears suddenly gleamed in her eyes. "If to your mind all this is necessary, so be it. So be it. but I beg you not to meet me. I no longer lived in Great Dvoriansky Street, but in the suburb with my old nurse Karpovna, a good-natured but gloomy old woman who always foreboded some harm, was afraid of all dreams. And even in the bees and wasps that flew into her room saw omens of evil, and the fact that I had become a workman, to her thinking, boded nothing good. Your life is ruined, she would say, mournfully shaking her head, ruined. Her adopted son Prokofy, a huge, uncouth, red-headed fellow of 30, with bristling mustaches, a butcher by trade, lived in the little house with her. When he met me in the passage, he would make way for me in respectful silence, and if he was drunk, he would salute me with all 5 fingers at once. He used to have supper in the evening, and through the partition wall of boards I could hear him clear his throat and sigh as he drank off glass after glass. Mama, he would call in an undertone. Well, Karpovna, who was passionately devoted to her adopted son, would respond, What is it, Sonny? I can show you a testimony of my affection, Mama. All this earthly life I will cherish you in your declining years in this vale of tears, and when you die I will bury you at my expense. I have said it, and you can believe it. I got up every morning before sunrise and went to bed early. We house painters ate a great deal and slept soundly. The only thing amiss was that my heart used to beat violently at night. I did not quarrel with my mates. Violent abuse, desperate oaths, and wishes such as, blast your eyes or cholera take you, never ceased all day, but nevertheless, we lived on very friendly terms. The other fellows suspected me of being some sort of religious sectary and made good-natured jokes at my expense, saying that even my own father had disowned me, and thereupon would add that they rarely went into the temple of God themselves, and that many of them had not been to confession for 10 years. They justified this laxity on their part by saying that a painter among men was like a jackdaw among birds. The men had a good opinion of me and treated me with respect. It was evident that my not drinking, not smoking, but leading a quiet, steady life pleased them very much. It was only an unpleasant shock to them that I took no hand in stealing oil and did not go with them to ask for tips from people on whose property we were working. Stealing oil and paints from those who employed them was a house painter's custom and was not regarded as theft, and it was remarkable that even so upright a man as Radish would always carry away a little white lead and oil as he went home from work. And even the most respectable old fellows, who owned the houses in which they lived in the suburb, were not ashamed to ask for a tip. And it made me feel vexed and ashamed to see the men go in a body to congratulate some nonentity on the commencement or the completion of the job, and thank him with degrading servility when they had received a few coppers. With people on whose work they were engaged, they behaved like wily courtiers, and almost every day I was reminded of Shakespeare's Polonius. I fancy it is going to rain, the man whose house was being painted would say, looking at the sky. It is? There is not a doubt it is, the painters would agree. I don't think it is a rain cloud, though. Perhaps it won't rain after all. No, it won't, Your Honor. I am sure it won't. But their attitude to their patrons behind their backs was usually one of irony, and when they saw, for instance, a gentleman sitting in the veranda reading a newspaper, they would observe, "He reads the paper, but I dare say he has nothing to eat. I never went home to see my own people. When I came back from work, I often found waiting for me little notes, brief and anxious, in which my sister wrote to me about my father, that he had been particularly preoccupied at dinner and had eaten nothing, or that he had been giddy and staggering, or that he had locked himself in his room and had not come out for a long time. Such items of news troubled me. I could not sleep, and at times even walked up and down Great Dvoriansky Street at night by our house, looking in at the dark windows and trying to guess whether everything was well at home. On Sundays my sister came to see me, but came in secret, as though it were not to see me but our nurse, and if she came in to see me she was very pale, with tear-stained eyes, and she began crying at once. "Our father will never live through this," she would say. "If anything should happen to him, God grant it may not, your conscience will torment you all your life. It's awful, Miss Ale. For our mother's sake, I beseech you, reform your ways." "My darling sister," I would say, "how can I reform my ways if I am convinced that I am acting in accordance with my conscience? Do understand? I know you are acting on your conscience, but perhaps it could be done differently, somehow, so as not to wound anybody." "Ah, holy saints!" The old woman sighed through the door. "Your life is ruined. There will be trouble, my dears, there will be trouble." Chapter 6. One Sunday Dr. Blagovo turned up unexpectedly. He was wearing a military tunic over a silk shirt and high boots of patent leather. "I have come to see you," he began, shaking my hand heartily like a student. "I am hearing about you every day, and I have been meaning to come and have a heart-to-heart talk, as they say. The boredom in the town is awful. There is not a living soul, no one to say a word to. It's hot, Holy Mother," he went on, taking off his tunic and sitting in his silk shirt. "My dear fellow, let me talk to you. I was dull myself, and had for a long time been craving for the society of someone not a house painter. I was genuinely glad to see him. I'll begin by saying," he said, sitting down on my bed, "that I sympathize with you from the bottom of my heart and deeply respect the life you are leading. They don't understand you here in the town, and, indeed, there is no one to understand, seeing that, as you know, they are all, with very few exceptions, regular Gogolesque pig faces here. but I saw what you were at once that time at the picnic. You are a noble soul, an honest, high-minded man. I respect you and feel it a great honor to shake hands with you," he went on enthusiastically. "To have made such a complete and violent change of life as you have done, you must have passed through a complicated spiritual crisis, and to continue this manner of life now, and to keep up to the high standard of your convictions continually, must be a strain on your mind and heart from day to day. Now to begin our talk. Tell me, don't you consider that if you had spent your strength of will, this strained activity, all these powers on something else, for instance, on gradually becoming a great scientist or artist, your life would have been broader and deeper and would have been more productive? We talked, and when we got upon manual labor, I expressed this idea that what is wanted is that the strong should not enslave the weak, that the minority should not be a parasite on the majority, nor a vampire forever sucking its vital sap, that is, all, without exception, strong and weak, rich and poor, should take part equally in the struggle for existence, each one on his own account, and that there was no better means for equalizing things in that way than manual labor, in the form of universal service, compulsory for all. Then do you think everyone without exception ought to engage in manual labor?" asked the doctor. "Yes. And don't you think that if everyone, including the best men, the thinkers and great scientists, taking part in the struggle for existence, each on his own account, are going to waste their time breaking stones and painting roofs, may not that threaten a grave danger to progress?" "Where is the danger?" I asked. "Why, progress is in deeds of love, in fulfilling the moral law. If you don't enslave anyone, if you don't oppress anyone, what further progress do you want?" "But excuse me," Blagovo suddenly fired up, rising to his feet. "But, excuse me, if a snail in its shell busies itself over perfecting its own personality and muddles about with the moral law, do you call that progress?" "Why muddles?" I said, offended. "If you don't force your neighbor to feed and clothe you, to transport you from place to place and defend you from your enemies, surely in the midst of a life entirely resting on slavery, that is progress, isn't it?" "To my mind it is the most important progress, and perhaps the only one possible and necessary for man. The limits of universal world progress are in infinity, and to talk of some possible progress limited by our needs and temporary theories is, excuse my saying so, positively strange. If the limits of progress are in infinity, as you say, it follows that its aims are not definite," I said. "To live without knowing definitely what you are living for, so be it. But that not knowing is not so dull as your knowing I am going up a ladder which is called progress, civilization, culture. I go on and up without knowing definitely where I am going, but really it is worth living for the sake of that delightful ladder. While you know what you are living for, you live for the sake of some people's not enslaving others, that the artist and the man who rubs his paints may dine equally well. But you know that's the petty, bourgeois, kitchen, gray side of life, and surely it is revolting to live for that alone. If some insects do enslave others, bother them, let them devour each other. We need not think about them. You know they will die and decay just the same however zealously you rescue them from slavery. We must think of that great millennium which awaits humanity in the remote future. Blagovo argued warmly with me, but at the same time one could see he was troubled by some irrelevant idea. I suppose your sister is not coming, he said, looking at his watch. She was at our house yesterday and said she would be seeing you today. You keep saying slavery, slavery, he went on, but you know that is a special question, and all such questions are solved by humanity gradually. We began talking of doing things gradually. I said that the question of doing good or evil everyone settles for himself, without waiting till humanity settles it by the way of gradual development. Moreover, this gradual process has more than one aspect. Side by side with the gradual development of human ideas, the gradual growth of ideas of another order is observed. Serfdom is no more, but the capitalist system is growing. And in the very heyday of emancipating ideas, just as in the days of Beatty, the majority feeds, clothes, and defends the minority while remaining hungry, inadequately clad, and defenseless. Such an order of things can be made to fit in finely with any tendencies and currents of thought you like, because the art of enslaving is also gradually being cultivated. We no longer flog our servants in the stable, but we give to slavery refined forms. At least, we succeed in finding a justification for it in each particular case. Ideas are ideas with us, but if now, at the end of the 19th century, it were possible to lay the burden of the most unpleasant of our physiological functions upon the working class, we should certainly do so. And afterwards, of course, justify ourselves by saying that if the best people, the thinkers and great scientists, were to waste their precious time on these functions, progress might be menaced with great danger. But at this point my sister arrived. Seeing the doctor, she was fluttered and troubled, and began saying immediately that it was time for her to go home to her father. Cleopatra Alexeyevna, said Blagovo earnestly, pressing both hands to his heart, what will happen to your father if you spend half an hour or so with your brother and me? He was frank, and knew how to communicate his liveliness to others. After a moment's thought, my sister laughed, and all at once became suddenly gay as she had been at the picnic. We went out into the country, and lying in the grass went on with our talk, and looked towards the town where all the windows facing west were like glittering gold because the sun was setting. After that, whenever my sister was coming to see me, Blagovo turned up too, and they always greeted each other as though their meeting in my room was accidental. My sister listened while the doctor and I argued, and at such times her expression was joyfully enthusiastic, full of tenderness and curiosity, and it seemed to me that a new world she had never dreamed of before, and which she was now striving to fathom, was gradually opening before her eyes. When the doctor was not there, she was quiet and sad, and now if she sometimes shed tears as she sat on my bed, it was for reasons of which she did not speak. In August, Radish ordered us to be ready to go to the railway line. 2 days before we were banished from the town, my father came to see me. He sat down and in a leisurely way, without looking at me, wiped his red face, then took out of his pocket our town messenger and deliberately, with emphasis on each word, read out the news that the son of the branch manager of the state bank, a young man of my age, had been appointed head of a department in the exchequer. "And now look at you," he said, folding up the newspaper, "a beggar, in rags, good for nothing. Even working-class people and peasants obtain education in order to become men, while you, a Poloznev, with ancestors of rank and distinction, aspire to the gutter. But I have not come here to talk to you. I have washed my hands of you," he added in a stifled voice, getting up. "I have come to find out where your sister is, you worthless fellow. She left home after dinner, and here it is nearly 8, and she is not back. She has taken to going out frequently without telling me. She is less dutiful, and I see in it your evil and degrading influence. Where is she?" In his hand he had the umbrella I knew so well, and I was already flustered and drew myself up like a schoolboy, expecting my father to begin hitting me with it. But he noticed my glance at the umbrella, and most likely that restrained him. "Live as you please," he said. "I shall not give you my blessing." "Holy saints," my nurse muttered behind the door. "You poor, unlucky child." Ah, my heart bodes ill. I worked on the railway line. It rained without stopping all August. It was damp and cold. They had not carried the corn in the fields, and on big farms where the wheat had been cut by machines it lay not in sheaves but in heaps. And I remember how those luckless heaps of wheat turned blacker every day, and the grain was sprouting in them. It was hard to work. The pouring rain spoiled everything we managed to do. We were not allowed to live or to sleep in the railway buildings, and we took refuge in the damp and filthy mud huts in which the navvies had lived during the summer, and I could not sleep at night for the cold and the woodlice crawling on my face and hands. And when we worked near the bridges, the navvies used to come in the evenings in a gang, simply in order to beat the painters. It was a form of sport to them. They used to beat us, to steal our brushes, and to annoy us and rouse us to fight. They used to spoil our work. They would, for instance, smear over the signal boxes with green paint. To complete our troubles, Radish took to paying us very irregularly. All the painting work on the line was given out to a contractor. He gave it out to another, and this subcontractor gave it to Radish after subtracting 20% for himself. The job was not a profitable one in itself, and the rain made it worse. Time was wasted. We could not work while Radish was obliged to pay the fellows by the day. The hungry painters almost came to beating him, called him a cheat, a bloodsucker, a Judas, while he, poor fellow, sighed, lifted up his hand to heaven in despair, and was continually going to Madame Tcheprikov for money. Chapter 7. Autumn came on, rainy, dark, and muddy. The season of unemployment set in, and I used to sit at home out of work for 3 days at a stretch, or did various little jobs, not in the painting line. For instance, I wheeled earth, earning about 4 pence a day by it. Dr. Blagovo had gone away to Petersburg. My sister had given up coming to see me. Radish was laid up at home ill, expecting death from day to day. And my mood was autumnal too. Perhaps because, having become a workman, I saw our town life only from the seamy side. It was my lot almost every day to make discoveries which reduced me almost to despair. Those of my fellow citizens, about whom I had no opinion before, or who had externally appeared perfectly decent, turned out now to be base, cruel people, capable of any dirty action. We common people were deceived, cheated, and kept waiting for hours together in the cold entry or the kitchen. We were insulted and treated with the utmost rudeness. In the autumn I papered the reading room and 2 other rooms at the club. I was paid 1 3 farthings the piece, but had to sign a receipt at the rate of 2 pence halfpenny, and when I refused to do so, a gentleman of benevolent appearance in gold-rimmed spectacles, who must have been one of the club committee, said to me, "If you say much more, you blackguard, I'll pound your face into a jelly." And when the flunkey whispered to him what I was, the son of Poloznev the architect, he became embarrassed, turned crimson, but immediately recovered himself and said, "Devil take him." In the shops they palmed off on us workmen putrid meat, musty flour, and tea that had been used and dried again. The police hustled us in church, the assistants and nurses in the hospital plundered us, and if we were too poor to give them a bribe, they revenged themselves by bringing us food in dirty vessels. In the post office, the pettiest official considered he had a right to treat us like animals, and to shout with coarse insolence, "You wait, where are you shoving?" to even the house dogs were unfriendly to us, and fell upon us with peculiar viciousness. But the thing that struck me most of all in my new position was the complete lack of justice. What is defined by the peasants in the words, "They have forgotten God." Rarely did a day pass without swindling. We were swindled by the merchants who sold us oil, by the contractors and the workmen and the people who employed us. I need not say that there could never be a question of our rights, and we always had to ask for the money we earned as though it were a charity, and to stand waiting for it at the back door, cap in hand. I was papering a room at the club next to the reading room in the evening, When I was just getting ready to go, the daughter of Dolchikov, the engineer, walked into the room with a bundle of books under her arm. I bowed to her. "Oh, how do you do?" she said, recognizing me at once and holding out her hand. "I'm very glad to see you." She smiled and looked with curiosity and wonder at my smock, my pail of paste, the paper stretched on the floor. I was embarrassed, and she, too, felt awkward. "You must excuse my looking at you like this," she said. "I have been told so much about you, especially by Dr. Blagovo. He is simply in love with you. And I have made the acquaintance of your sister too, a sweet, dear girl. But I can never persuade her that there is nothing awful about your adopting this simple life. On the contrary, you have become the most interesting man in the town." She looked again at the pail of paste and the wallpaper, and went on. "I asked Dr. Blagovo to make me better acquainted with you, but apparently he forgot, or had not time. Anyway, we are acquainted all the same. And if you would come and see me, quite simply, I should be extremely indebted to you. I so long to have a talk. I am a simple person," she added, holding out her hand to me, "and I hope that you will feel no constraint with me. My father is not here. He is in Petersburg." She went off into the reading room, rustling her skirts, while I went home, and for a long time could not get to sleep. That cheerless autumn, some kind soul, evidently wishing to alleviate my existence, sent me from time to time tea and lemons, or biscuits, or roast game. Karpovna told me that they were always brought by a soldier, and from whom they came she did not know, and the soldier used to inquire whether I was well, and whether I dined every day, and whether I had warm clothing. When the frost began, I was presented in the same way in my absence with a soft knitted scarf brought by the soldier. There was a faint, elusive smell of scent about it, and I guessed who my good fairy was. The scarf smelt of lilies of the valley, the favorite scent of Anyuta Blagovo. Towards winter there was more work, and it was more cheerful. Radish recovered, and we worked together in the cemetery church, where we were putting the groundwork on the icon stand afore gilding. It was a clean, quiet job, and, as our fellows used to say, profitable. One could get through a lot of work in a day, and the time passed quickly, imperceptibly. There was no swearing, no laughter, no loud talk. The place itself compelled one to quietness and decent behavior, and disposed one to quiet, serious thoughts. Absorbed in our work, we stood or sat motionless like statues. There was a deathly silence in keeping with the cemetery, so that if a tool fell or a flame spluttered in the lamp, the noise of such sounds rang out abrupt and resonant, and made us look round. After a long silence we would hear a buzzing like the swarming of bees. It was the requiem of a baby being chanted slowly in subdued voices in the porch, or an artist, painting a dove with stars round it on a cupola, would begin softly whistling, and recollecting himself with a start, would at once relapse into silence. Or Radish, answering his thoughts, would say with a sigh, "Anything is possible." Anything is possible, or a slow disconsolate bell would begin ringing over our heads, and the painters would observe that it must be for the funeral of some wealthy person. My days I spent in this stillness in the twilight of the church, and in the long evenings I played billiards, or went to the theater in the gallery wearing the new trousers I had bought out of my own earnings. Concerts and performances had already begun at the Ajogans Radish used to paint the scenes alone now. He used to tell me the plot of the plays and describe the tableaux vivants which he witnessed. I listened to him with envy. I felt greatly drawn to the rehearsals, but I could not bring myself to go to the Ajogans. A week before Christmas, Dr. Blagovo arrived, and again we argued and played billiards in the evenings. When he played, he used to take off his coat and unbutton his shirt over his chest, and for some reason tried altogether to assume the air of a desperate rake. He did not drink much, but made a great uproar about it, and had a special faculty for getting through 20 rubles in an evening at such a poor cheap tavern as the Volga. My sister began coming to see me again. They both expressed surprise every time on seeing each other, but from her joyful, guilty face it was evident that these meetings were not accidental. One evening, when we were playing billiards, the doctor said to me, "I say, why don't you go and see Miss Dolzhikov? You don't know Maria Viktorovna. She is a clever creature, a charmer, a simple, good-natured soul." I described how her father had received me in the spring. "Nonsense," laughed the doctor. "The engineer's one thing, and she's another. Really, my dear fellow, you mustn't be nasty to her. Go and see her sometimes. For instance, let's go and see her tomorrow evening. What do you say?" He persuaded me. The next evening I put on my new serge trousers, and in some agitation I set off to Miss Dolzhikov's. The footman did not seem so haughty and terrible, nor the furniture so gorgeous, as on that morning when I had come to ask a favor. Maria Viktorovna was expecting me, and she received me like an old acquaintance, shaking hands with me in a friendly way. She was wearing a gray cloth dress with full sleeves, and had her hair done in the style which we used to call dog's ears when it came into fashion in the town a year before. The hair was combed down over the ears, and this made Maria Viktorovna's face look broader, and she seemed to me this time very much like her father, whose face was broad and red, with something in its expression like a sledge driver. She was handsome and elegant, but not youthful looking. She looked 30, though in reality she was not more than 25. "Dear doctor, how grateful I am to you," she said, making me sit down. "If it hadn't been for him, you wouldn't have come to see me. I am bored to death. My father has gone away and left me alone, and I don't know what to do with myself in this town." Then she began asking me where I was working now, how much I earned, where I lived. "Do you spend on yourself nothing but what you earn?" she asked. "No." "Happy man," she sighed. "All the evil in life, it seems to me, comes from idleness, boredom, and spiritual emptiness, and all this is inevitable when one is accustomed to living at other people's expense." Don't think I am showing off. I tell you truthfully, it is not interesting or pleasant to be rich. "Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness" is said, because there is not and cannot be a mammon that's righteous. She looked round at the furniture with a grave, cold expression, as though she wanted to count it over, and went on. "Comfort and luxury have a magical power. Little by little they draw into their clutches even strong-willed people. At one time Father and I lived simply, not in a rich style, but now you see how." "It is something monstrous," she said, shrugging her shoulders. "We spend up to 20,000 a year. In the provinces. One comes to look at comfort and luxury as the invariable privilege of capital and education," I said, "and it seems to me that the comforts of life may be combined with any sort of labor, even the hardest and dirtiest. Your father is rich, and yet he says himself that it has been his lot to be a mechanic and an oiler." She smiled and shook her head doubtfully. "My father sometimes eats bread dipped in kvass," she said. "It's a fancy, a whim." At that moment there was a ring, and she got up. "The rich and well-educated ought to work like everyone else," she said, "and if there is comfort it ought to be equal for all. There ought not to be any privileges. But that's enough philosophizing. Tell me something amusing. Tell me about the painters. What are they like? Funny." The doctor came in. I began telling them about the painters, but, being unaccustomed to talking, I was constrained, and described them like an ethnologist, gravely and tediously. The doctor, too, told us some anecdotes of working men. He staggered about, shed tears, dropped on his knees, and even, mimicking a drunkard, lay on the floor. It was as good as a play, and Maria Viktorovna laughed till she cried as she looked at him. Then he played on the piano and sang in his thin, pleasant tenor, while Maria Viktorovna stood by and picked out what he was to sing and corrected him when he made a mistake. "I've heard that you sing, too," I inquired. "Sing, too," cried the doctor in horror. "She sings exquisitely, a perfect artist, and you talk of her singing too. What an idea!" "I did study in earnest at one time," she said, answering my question, "but now I have given it up." Sitting on a low stool, she told us of her life in Petersburg and mimicked some celebrated singers, imitating their voice and manner of singing. She made a sketch of the doctor in her album. Then of me she did not draw well, but both the portraits were like us. She laughed and was full of mischief and charming grimaces. And this suited her better than talking about the mammon of unrighteousness, and it seemed to me that she had been talking just before about wealth and luxury, not in earnest, but in imitation of someone. She was a superb comic actress. I mentally compared her with our young ladies, and even the handsome, dignified Anyuta Blagovo could not stand comparison with her. The difference was immense, like the difference between a beautiful, cultivated rose and a wild briar. We had supper together, the three of us. The doctor and Maria Viktorovna drank red wine, champagne, and coffee with brandy in it. They clinked glasses and drank to friendship, to enlightenment, to progress, to liberty. And they did not get drunk but only flushed, and were continually, for no reason, laughing till they cried. So as not to be tiresome, I drank claret too. Talented, richly endowed natures, said Miss Dolzhikov, know how to live and go their own way. Mediocre people, like myself for instance, know nothing and can do nothing of themselves. There is nothing left for them but to discern some deep social movement and to float where they are carried by it. How can one discern what doesn't exist? Asked the doctor. We think so because we don't see it. Is that so? The social movements are the invention of the new literature. There are none among us. An argument began. There are no deep social movements among us and never have been, the doctor declared loudly. There is no end to what the new literature has invented. It has invented intellectual workers in the country, and you may search through all our villages and find at the most some lout in a reefer jacket or a black frock coat who will make 4 mistakes in spelling a word of 3 letters. Cultured life has not yet begun among us. There's the same savagery, the same uniform boorishness, the same triviality as 500 years ago. Movements, currents there have been, but it has all been petty, paltry, bent upon vulgar and mercenary interests, and one cannot see anything important in them. If you think you have discerned a deep social movement, and in following it you devote yourself to tasks in the modern taste, such as the emancipation of insects from slavery or abstinence from beef rissoles, I congratulate you, madam. We must study and study and study, and we must wait a bit. With our deep social movements, we are not mature enough for them yet. And to tell the truth, we don't know anything about them. You don't know anything about them, but I do, said Maria Viktorovna. Goodness, how tiresome you are today. Our duty is to study and to study, to try to accumulate as much knowledge as possible, for genuine social movements arise where there is knowledge, and the happiness of mankind in the future lies only in knowledge. I drink to science. There is no doubt about one thing: one must organize one's life. Somehow differently, said Maria Viktorovna, after a moment's silence and thought. Life, such as it has been hitherto, is not worth having. Don't let us talk about it. As we came away from her, the cathedral clock struck 2. "Did you like her?" asked the doctor. "She's nice, isn't she?" On Christmas Day we dined with Maria Viktorovna, and all through the holidays we went to see her almost every day. There was never anyone there but ourselves, and she was right when she said that she had no friends in the town but the doctor and me. We spent our time for the most part in conversation. Sometimes the doctor brought some book or magazine and read aloud to us. In reality, he was the first well-educated man I had met in my life. I cannot judge whether he knew a great deal, but he always displayed his knowledge as though he wanted other people to share it. When he talked about anything relating to medicine, he was not like any one of the doctors in our town, but made a fresh, peculiar impression upon me, and I fancied that if he liked, he might have become a real man of science. And he was perhaps the only person who had a real influence upon me at that time. Seeing him and reading the books he gave me, I began little by little to feel a thirst for the knowledge which would have given significance to my cheerless labor. It seemed strange to me, for instance, that I had not known till then that the whole world was made up of 60 elements. I had not known what oil was, what paints were, and that I could have got on without knowing these things. My acquaintance with the doctor elevated me morally too. I was continually arguing with him, and, though I usually remained of my own opinion, yet, thanks to him, I began to perceive that everything was not clear to me, and I began trying to work out as far as I could definite convictions in myself, that the dictates of conscience might be definite, and that there might be nothing vague in my mind. Yet, though he was the most cultivated and best man in the town, he was nevertheless far from perfection. In his manners, in his habit of turning every conversation into an argument, in his pleasant tenor, even in his friendliness, there was something coarse, like a divinity student, and when he took off his coat and sat in his silk shirt, or flung a tip to a waiter in the restaurant, I always fancied that culture might be all very well, but the Tatar was fermenting in him still. At Epiphany he went back to Petersburg. He went off in the morning, and after dinner my sister came in. Without taking off her fur coat and her cap, she sat down in silence, very pale, and kept her eyes fixed on the same spot. She was chilled by the frost, and one could see that she was upset by it. "You must have caught cold," I said. Her eyes filled with tears. She got up and went out to Karpovna, without saying a word to me, as though I had hurt her feelings. And a little later I heard her saying, in a tone of bitter reproach, "Nurse, what have I been living for till now?" "What? Tell me, haven't I wasted my youth? All the best years of my life, to know nothing but keeping accounts, pouring out tea, counting the halfpence, entertaining visitors, and thinking there was nothing better in the world. Nurse, do you understand? I have the cravings of a human being, and I want to live, and they have turned me into something like a housekeeper. It's horrible, horrible. She flung her keys towards the door, and they fell with a jingle into my room. They were the keys of the sideboard, of the kitchen cupboard, of the cellar, and of the tea caddy, the keys which my mother used to carry. "Oh, merciful heavens!" cried the old woman in horror. "Holy saints above!" Before going home, my sister came into my room to pick up the keys and said, "You must forgive me. Something queer has happened to me lately." Chapter 8. On returning home late one evening from Maria Viktorovna's, I found waiting in my room a young police inspector in a new uniform. He was sitting at my table, looking through my books. "At last," he said, getting up and stretching himself. "This is the third time I have been to you. The governor commands you to present yourself before him at 9 o'clock in the morning, without fail." Oh. He took from me a signed statement that I would act upon His Excellency's command and went away. This late visit of the police inspector and unexpected invitation to the governor's had an overwhelmingly oppressive effect upon me. From my earliest childhood I have felt terror-stricken in the presence of gendarmes, policemen, and law court officials, and now I was tormented by uneasiness, as though I were really guilty in some way, and I could not get to sleep. My nurse and Prokofy were also upset and could not sleep. My nurse had earache too, she moaned, and several times began crying with pain. Hearing that I was awake, Prokofy came into my room with a lamp and sat down at the table. "You ought to have a drink of pepper cordial," he said. After a moment's thought, "If one does have a drink in this vale of tears, it does no harm. And if Mamma were to pour a little pepper cordial in her ear, it would do her a lot of good." Between 2 and 3 he was going to the slaughterhouse for the meat. I knew I should not sleep till morning now, and to get through the time till 9 o'clock I went with him. We walked with a lantern, while his boy Nikolka, aged 13, with blue patches on his cheeks from frostbites, a regular young brigand to judge by his expression, drove after us in the sledge, urging on the horse in a husky voice. "I suppose they will punish you at the governor's?" Prokofy said to me on the way. "There are rules of the trade for governors, and rules for the higher clergy, and rules for the officers, and rules for the doctors, and every class has its rules. But you haven't kept to your rules, and you can't be allowed." The slaughterhouse was behind the cemetery. Until then I had only seen it in the distance. It consisted of 3 gloomy barns, surrounded by a gray fence, and when the wind blew from that quarter on hot days in summer, it brought a stifling stench from them. Now going into the yard in the dark, I did not see the barns. I kept coming across horses and sledges, some empty, some loaded up with meat. Men were walking about with lanterns, swearing in a disgusting way. Prokofy and Nikolka swore just as revoltingly, and the air was in a continual uproar with swearing, coughing, and the neighing of horses. There was a smell of dead bodies and of dung. It was thawing, the snow was changing into mud, and in the darkness it seemed to me that I was walking through pools of blood. Having piled up the sledges full of meat, we set off to the butcher's shop in the market. It began to get light. Cooks with baskets and elderly ladies in mantles came along one after another. Prokofy, with a chopper in his hand, in a white apron spattered with blood, swore fearful oaths, crossed himself at the church, shouted aloud for the whole market to hear that he was giving away the meat at cost price, and even at a loss to himself. He gave short weight and short change. The cooks saw that, but, deafened by his shouts, did not protest, and only called him a hangman. Brandishing and bringing down his terrible chopper, he threw himself into picturesque attitudes, and each time uttered the sound gek with a ferocious expression, and I was afraid he really would chop off somebody's head or hand. I spent all the morning in the butcher's shop, and when at last I went to the governor's, my overcoat smelt of meat and blood. My state of mind was as though I were being sent spear in hand to meet a bear. I remember the tall staircase with a striped carpet on it, and the young official with shiny buttons, who mutely motioned me to the door with both hands, and ran to announce me. I went into a hall luxuriously but frigidly and tastelessly furnished, and the high, narrow mirrors in the spaces between the walls and the bright yellow window curtains struck the eye particularly unpleasantly. One could see that the governors were changed, but the furniture remained the same. Again the young official motioned me with both hands to the door, and I went up to a big green table at which a military general with the Order of Vladimir on his breast was standing. "Mr. Poloznev, I have asked you to come," he began, holding a letter in his hand and opening his mouth like a round O. "I have asked you to come here to inform you of this. Your highly respected father has appealed by letter and by word of mouth to the marshal of the nobility, begging him to summon you and to lay before you the inconsistency of your behavior with the rank of the nobility to which you have the honor to belong. His Excellency Alexander Pavlovich, justly supposing that your conduct might serve as a bad example, and considering that mere persuasion on his part would not be sufficient, but that official intervention in earnest was essential, presents me here in this letter with his views in regard to you, which I share." He said this, quietly, respectfully, standing erect, as though I were his superior officer and looking at me with no trace of severity. His face looked worn and wizened, and was all wrinkles. There were bags under his eyes, his hair was dyed, and it was impossible to tell from his appearance how old he was, 40 or 60. "I trust," he went on, "that you appreciate the delicacy of our honored Alexander Pavlovich, who has addressed himself to me not officially, but privately. I, too, have asked you to come here unofficially, and I am speaking to you, not as a governor, but from a sincere regard for your father. And so I beg you either to alter your line of conduct and return to duties in keeping with your rank, or to avoid setting a bad example, remove to another district where you are not known, and where you can follow any occupation you please. In the other case, I shall be forced to take extreme measures." He stood for half a minute in silence, looking at me with his mouth open. "Are you a vegetarian?" he asked. "No, Your Excellency, I eat meat." He sat down and drew some papers towards him. I bowed and went out. It was not worthwhile now to go to work before dinner. I went home to sleep, but could not sleep from an unpleasant, sickly feeling, induced by the slaughterhouse and my conversation with the governor, and when the evening came I went, gloomy and out of sorts, to Maria Viktorovna. I told her how I had been at the governor's, while she stared at me in perplexity, as though she did not believe it, then suddenly began laughing gaily, loudly, irrepressibly, as only good-natured laughter-loving people can. "If only one could tell that in Petersburg," she brought out, almost falling over with laughter and propping herself against the table. "If one could tell that in Petersburg." Chapter 9. Ein. Now we used to see each other often, sometimes twice a day. She used to come to the cemetery almost every day after dinner and read the epitaphs on the crosses and tombstones while she waited for me. Sometimes she would come into the church and, standing by me, would look on while I worked. The stillness, the nave work of the painters and gilders, Radish's sage reflections, and the fact that I did not differ externally from the other workmen and worked just as they did in my waistcoat with no socks on, and that I was addressed familiarly by them, all this was new to her and touched her. One day a workman, who was painting a dove on the ceiling, called out to me in her presence, "Miss Sale, hand me up the white paint." I took him the white paint, and afterwards, when I let myself down by the frail scaffolding, she looked at me, touched to tears and smiling. "What a dear you are," she said. I remembered from my childhood how a green parrot, belonging to one of the rich men of the town, had escaped from its cage, and how for quite a month afterwards the beautiful bird had haunted the town, flying from garden to garden, homeless and solitary. Maria Viktorovna reminded me of that bird. "There is positively nowhere for me to go now but the cemetery," she said to me with a laugh. "The town has become disgustingly dull. At the Azhogins they are still reciting, singing, lisping. I have grown to detest them of late. Your sister is an unsociable creature. Mademoiselle Blagovo hates me for some reason. I don't care for the theater. Tell me, where am I to go?" When I went to see her, I smelt of paint and turpentine, and my hands were stained, and she liked that. She wanted me to come to her in my ordinary working clothes. But in her drawing room, those clothes made me feel awkward. I felt embarrassed, as though I were in uniform, so I always put on my new serge trousers when I went to her, and she did not like that. "You must own you are not quite at home in your new character," she said to me one day. "Your workman's dress does not feel natural to you. You are awkward in it. Tell me, isn't that because you haven't a firm conviction and are not satisfied? The very kind of work you have chosen your painting, surely it does not satisfy you, does it? she asked, laughing. I know paint makes things look nicer and last longer, but those things belong to rich people who live in towns, and after all they are luxuries. Besides, you have often said yourself that everybody ought to get his bread by the work of his own hands, yet you get money and not bread. Why shouldn't you keep to the literal sense of your words? You ought to be getting bread. That is, you ought to be plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing, or doing something which has a direct connection with agriculture, for instance, looking after cows, digging, building huts of logs. She opened a pretty cupboard that stood near her writing table and said, I am saying all this to you because I want to let you into my secret. Voile. This is my agricultural library. Here I have fields, kitchen garden, and orchard, and cat laird and beehives. I read them greedily, and have already learnt all the theory to the tiniest detail. My dream, my darling wish, is to go to our Dubetchnya as soon as March is here. It's marvelous there, exquisite, isn't it? The first year I shall have a look round and get into things, and the year after I shall begin to work properly myself, putting my back into it, as they say. My father has promised to give me Dubetchnya, and I shall do exactly what I like with it. Flushed, excited to tears, and laughing, she dreamed aloud how she would live at Dubetchnya, and what an interesting life it would be. I envied her. March was near. The days were growing longer and longer, and on bright sunny days water dripped from the roofs at midday, and there was a fragrance of spring. I, too, longed for the country. And when she said that she should move to Dubetchnya, I realized vividly that I should remain in the town alone, and I felt that I envied her with her cupboard of books and her agriculture. I knew nothing of work on the land, and did not like it, and I should have liked to have told her that work on the land was slavish toil, but I remembered that something similar had been said more than once by my father, and I held my tongue. Lent began. Victor Ivanitch, whose existence I had begun to forget, arrived from Petersburg. He arrived unexpectedly, without even a telegram to say he was coming. When I went in, as usual in the evening, he was walking about the drawing room, telling some story with his face freshly washed and shaven, looking 10 years younger. His daughter was kneeling on the floor, taking out of his trunk's boxes, bottles, and books, and handing them to Pavel the footman. I involuntarily drew back a step when I saw the engineer, but he held out both hands to me and said, smiling, showing his strong white teeth that looked like a sledge driver's, Here he is. Very glad to see you, Mr. House Painter. Masha has told me all about it. She has been singing your praises. I quite understand and approve, he went on, taking my arm. To be a good workman is ever so much more honest and more sensible than wasting government paper and wearing a cockade on your head. I myself worked in Belgium with these very hands, and then spent 2 years as a mechanic. He was wearing a short reefer jacket and indoor slippers. He walked like a man with the gout, rolling slightly from side to side and rubbing his hands. Humming something, he softly purred and hugged himself with satisfaction at being at home again at last, and able to have his beloved shower bath. "There is no disputing," he said to me at supper. "There is no disputing. You are all nice and charming people. But for some reason, as soon as you take to manual labor, or go in for saving the peasants, in the long run it all comes to no more than being a dissenter." "Aren't you a dissenter? Here you don't take vodka. What's the meaning of that if it is not being a dissenter?" To satisfy him, I drank some vodka, and I drank some wine too. We tasted the cheese, the sausage, the pits, the pickles, and the savories of all sorts that the engineer had brought with him, and the wine that had come in his absence from abroad. The wine was first rate. For some reason the engineer got wine and cigars from abroad without paying duty. The caviar and the dried sturgeon someone sent him for nothing. He did not pay rent for his flat, as the owner of the house provided the kerosene for the line. And altogether he and his daughter produced on me the impression that all the best in the world was at their service and provided for them for nothing. I went on going to see them, but not with the same eagerness. The engineer made me feel constrained, and in his presence I did not feel free. I could not face his clear, guileless eyes. His reflections wearied and sickened me. I was sickened, too, by the memory that so lately I had been in the employment of this red-faced, well-fed man, and that he had been brutally rude to me. It is true that he put his arm round my waist, slapped me on the shoulder in a friendly way, approved my manner of life. But I felt that, as before, he despised my insignificance and only put up with me to please his daughter, and I couldn't now laugh and talk as I liked, and I behaved unsociably and kept expecting that in another minute he would address me as pantily as he did his footman Pavel. How my pride as a provincial and a working man was revolted. I, a proletarian, a house painter, went every day to rich people who were alien to me, and whom the whole town regarded as though they were foreigners, and every day I drank costly wines with them and ate unusual dainties. My conscience refused to be reconciled to it. On my way to the house I sullenly avoided meeting people, and looked at them from under my brows as though I really were a dissenter. And when I was going home from the engineer's, I was ashamed of my well-fed condition. Above all, I was afraid of being carried away, whether I was walking along the street or working or talking to the other fellows. I was all the time thinking of one thing only, of going in the evening to see Maria Viktorovna, and was picturing her voice, her laugh, her movements. When I was getting ready to go to her, I always spent a long time before my nurse's warped looking glass. As I fastened my tie, my serge trousers were detestable in my eyes, and I suffered torments, and at the same time despised myself for being so trivial. When she called to me out of the other room that she was not dressed and asked me to wait. I listened to her dressing. It agitated me. I felt as though the ground were giving way under my feet. And when I saw a woman's figure in the street, even at a distance, I invariably compared it. It seemed to me that all our girls and women were vulgar, that they were absurdly dressed, and did not know how to hold themselves, and these comparisons aroused a feeling of pride in me. Maria Viktorovna was the best of them all, and I dreamed of her and myself at night. One evening at supper with the engineer, we ate a whole lobster. As I was going home afterwards, I remembered that the engineer twice called me my dear fellow at supper, and I reflected that they treated me very kindly in that house, as they might an unfortunate big dog who had been kicked out by its owners, that they were amusing themselves with me, and that when they were tired of me they would turn me out like a dog. I felt ashamed and wounded to the point of tears, as though I had been insulted, and looking up at the sky I took a vow to put an end to all this. The next day I did not go to the Dolzakovs. Late in the evening, when it was quite dark and raining, I walked along Great Doriansky Street, looking up at the windows. Everyone was asleep at the Ashogins, and the only light was in one of the furthest windows. It was Madame Ozhogin in her own room, sewing by the light of 3 candles, imagining that she was combating superstition. Our house was in darkness, but at the Dolzhikovs, on the contrary, the windows were lighted up, but one could distinguish nothing through the flowers and the curtains. I kept walking up and down the street. The cold March rain drenched me through. I heard my father come home from the club. He stood knocking at the gate. A minute later a light appeared at the window, and I saw my sister, who was hastening down with a lamp, while with the other hand she was twisting her thick hair together as she went. Then my father walked about the drawing room, talking and rubbing his hands, while my sister sat in a low chair, thinking and not listening to what he said. But then they went away. The light went out. I glanced round at the engineers, and there, too, all was darkness now. In the dark and the rain I felt hopelessly alone, abandoned to the whims of destiny. I felt that all my doings, my desires, and everything I had thought and said till then were trivial in comparison with my loneliness, in comparison with my present suffering and the suffering that lay before me in the future.